Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of John Dee. But this is supplementary material, part of a series of 3 concerning the works of Zosimos of Panopolis, mainly aimed at you who are either interested in ancient Greek writing or who are past Theorem 20. So let me share my screen on this, and I hope you will enjoy this very psychedelic text from Zosimos of Panopolis. Now, we're going to be talking about on the letter omega, but this is the third of a series. So everything about the context of this work and how John Dee gets it is in the first video. And in the second video, we talked about the vision of alchemical transformation, essentially the path of the initiate that Zosimus sets up in his most famous work on excellence. But what we're going to look at here is on the letter omega. For those of you in my monad course, you know all the interesting things Dee is doing with the letter omega. And you might have wondered, gee, where is this coming from? Other than the Bible, we know it's coming from the I am the Alpha and the Omega. Well, why is it so important in, say, Greek Kabbalah? So we're going to get all that, and also an unusual story of creation, Adam, and the elements. Now, there's a whole video below giving you the context on this. All I'm going to do here is remind you that this work of Zosimus is in the Codex Marcianus. That's the oldest surviving alchemical manuscript. It's copies of copies of copies from Panopolis, Egypt, that somehow wind up in Istanbul, which was then Constantinople, which is brought by Cardinal Bessarion Divinus. John Dee makes a copy the year before he writes the Hieroglyphic Monad. But it is the primary source for the works of Zosimos of Panopolis, and almost certainly Dee's only source. For more on that, please see the earlier video. So we're to the letter omega. What Zosimus has here is basically an encyclopedia of alchemy, and he's used each of the 24 Greek letters, and they can be 26 or 28 if you count different marks on them and so on. But it's part of an encyclopedia of alchemy. Unfortunately, most of that encyclopedia doesn't exist anymore. It's the version I am using is the only English translation I know of. It's rather rare. It was done by Howard Jackson back in 1978. So when I am quoting what Zosimus says, it's that translation I'm quoting. The only thing I've changed is, say, when Jackson translates a word like thauthos, I'm just going to put it in our usual modern spelling, thoth. Jackson was a student of the great translator and scholar of Greek magical papyri, Hans Dieter Betz, and thanks Betz profusely in his introduction for helping him with this. And it's a very, very detailed translation with notes that are probably 4 times longer than the translation itself. Taylor, who I've talked about in previous videos, also refers to this work, as does Shannon Grimes in her much more recent work, Becoming Gold. So if anyone is just joining me at this point, one of the things you need to know is the idea of alchemy in the Greco-Egyptian world is not changing lead into gold, right? There's a lot of metallurgical recipes, and the recipes work. The furnaces can be reproduced, but the idea is spiritual gold, and hence Grimes's book title there. Okay, so Zosimus is using the Greek letters as a cataloging device, but saying a little bit about each of them. And he says very interesting things about omega. He's writing to his sister Theosebia. As we know from before, Theosebia is probably not his biological sister. She's probably a sister in some organization or belief system that they're both a part of. Also, this is from the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, and Zosimus is writing probably right before the fall of the Library of Alexandria, which he refers to as if it's still standing. And so there is this great Greco-Roman, Egypto-Hebraic, Christian, pagan fusion going on that means you're rolling in different gods, goddesses, and appropriating them into whichever tradition is primary, or maybe for some people, none of it is. For example, someone can easily be both Christian and Jewish. I mean, Jesus was a Jew after all. Okay, so Jackson, in the translation, describes this work as among the most instructive documents of the alchemical corpus. That certainly has to do with the digressions rather than what Zosimus actually says here about how to use furnaces, because he doesn't really say a lot about furnaces. He's basically launching into this polemic against a rival school of alchemists after he talks about the letter omega, and he's talking about the relevance of a particular procedure for tincturing. Remember, one of the things they're doing sometimes is making tinctures, also dyes to make things look gold or look silver. So he digresses often. It's the digressions that we like. Now, I do have to tell you, if you like really tight linear arguments, this text is going to drive you nuts. You have to have kind of a sort of trippy, almost psychedelic attitude towards associative thought. Because if you wonder, for example, well, why did he just do that? You got to be okay with an answer that usually isn't really okay. It's like, well, I don't know, because that's what he does, because he's Zosimus and he's kind of a trippy dude. So we're going to look at the digressions more than the furnaces. I'm not going to go through the whole text. I'm going to focus on two areas in detail. What he says about the letter omega, and then what he says about first speech, first humans, kind of a Edenic creation where he has rolled Adam of the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition into this other world of Greco-Roman Egyptian stories. All right, so we're going to start out here. Round omega is the bipartite letter. That's how he opens it up, and that seems to make sense, right? There it is. It's a round letter. If you look at the lowercase one, it looks like it's in two parts. It's bipartite, but these Greek words are hacked words. They're difficult to translate in a way that is immediately understandable in modern English, and the minute that you do, you kind of limit what they mean. So the word for round, strongulos, can also mean spherical. It also can mean really hacked words, pithy or terse, like the word itself, which has multiple meanings. And then when you get to the other one, stoichion, it's a wild word. First of all, if you drop it into something like Google Translate, it's going to mean element usually. Yeah, that can be the four elements, but also just a unit of a thing. First, it comes into the language meaning a row or a series, although it doesn't have to be a linear row. It can be circular also, like sundials, the shadows of the gnomon indicating time. It can be a component part of a thing rather than one of the component parts of all things. It's usually, in terms of language, a simple vocal sound. Usually, if you were going to refer to a written letter, you'd write gramma. That's where we get our word grammar from. So it's significant that Zosimus is using omega as and describing it with stoichion, because we have that idea of the divine giving birth to speech. And the Judeo-Christian tradition in the beginning was the word, and the word was God, and so on. Now, stoichion also, just as a digression, for those of you who took physics or chemistry, you probably know the term stoichiometry, that wonderfully exasperating kind of math you have to do to work out the relationships between the weights of reactants, products, and units before, during, and after chemical reactions. Yeah, that word. It is being applied here to language. Also in the writing of later antiquity, basically ancient Greeks writing in the before the Common Era or during the Common Era. It can also mean a classical planet or part of the zodiac. And then finally, remember, this is when the New Testament is written in Greek. And in the New Testament, it tends to be translated in as elements when used in Galatians or other places. Okay, so let's see what we have about the letter omega. On the letter omega, he says, round omega is the bipartite letter, the one that in terms of material language belongs to the seventh planetary zone, that of Chronos. Or in terms of the immaterial, it is something else altogether, something inexplicable, which only Nikotheos, the hidden, knows. In material terms, omega is what he, this Nikotheos, the hidden, calls ocean, or as his work says, the birth and seed of all gods. As he says, the governing principle of material language, what he calls the great and wonderful letter omega, heads the section on apparatuses for the liquid of sulfur. Remember, sulfur in Greek is theon. It means the same thing as divine. It's often used in terms of divine fire. So the letter omega in this encyclopedia, for want of a better description, that Zosimos is writing to his sister Theosebia, it's heading the section on the liquid of sulfur furnaces of all sorts, mechanical and simple alike, and all matters in general. Whoa, that was a leap. So one of the things you might think about, and some of you can make these associations on your own, why is he associating it with Chronos? Who else would you associate with Chronos? Also the name Nikotheos. You probably haven't heard of him, at least I never had until I was looking at this text. If you translate it, it means victory of God. Like Nike, victory, Theos, God. Why does Nikotheos call Omega ocean? Well, we'll get to that, but one reason might simply be that it's a notericon. They share the same first letter. A lot of times people think of notericons in Hermetic Kabbalah with Hebrew, but for good reason, but the word itself comes from ancient Greek, where you're indicating a whole idea by the first letter, associating things that have the first letter, or less commonly the last letter, or even less commonly sometimes the first, middle, and last letter. Okay, but we'll get back to ocean in a minute. And I've already mentioned that the word for sulfur and divine are the same. So that will become important also. Now let's talk about, in terms of material language, that word material language, and that's supposed to be lead colored, by the way I've highlighted it, it's literally translated as embodied speech. It's the language embodied or corporeal humans would use as opposed to celestials or bodiless beings. Now, in terms of this victory of God Nikotheos person, he's this psychedelic 2nd century Jewish Christian visionary or prophet. Zosimus refers to him a lot. The Gnostics seem to love him. And remember, you can consider the Monas Hieroglyphica a Gnostic text among other things. I mean, late Gnostic, or you can apply the principles like the ascent of the one to it. But what we know about Nikotheos is mainly what other people say. He's known for his revelations of heavenly secrets. He gets these during journeys up in the heavenly celestial realms, where he goes and then he must come back somehow and write about them, and then he disappears. He can be equated or rolled into ideas about the prophet Enoch, for example, although I'm not saying they're the same thing. They certainly aren't. Their timing is totally wrong. Oh, as usual, I've got ahead here, so let me fix my screen. Hold on. I'll try this again here. So one of the things that it's important to know is that in many ways, Nikotheos seems like a model of the ideas of alchemical transformation, or the path of the initiate that Zosimus has and that we've seen in On Excellence. Essentially, that's going through the spiritual transformation that, according to some belief systems, you would go through after death, going through that while you're alive, bringing that knowledge back, or attaining it through meditation, incubation, whatever study one does on the path of the initiate. Remember, in Zosimus' On Excellence, he was going into a dream, seeing these metallurgical things happen that were traumatic, and then coming out and again saying, oh, I understand. I understand. The 4th time he understands, we know that he has attained spiritual gold. Now, you see there Kronos and his child. That's a 17th century depiction. Let's go through here again now and pick up Kronos. Okay, you probably have already equated Kronos with Saturn. Remember, this is the age of appropriation. That would be considered rude behavior now, but the Romans have already appropriated the Greek gods and goddesses, and now people are bringing them in, or have been bringing them in, rolling them in to the Egyptian pantheon, equating them with different things in the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, and we're before the Muslim tradition. So also remember that in Greek, each Greek vowel is paired with the 7 classical planets. There's 7 vowels. They equate to 7 musical notes, 7 planets. In Hesiod's Theogony, to get to ocean, Kronos and Ocean are brothers. They're the sons of heaven and earth. Now, the original Kronos is not the same as Father Time, but by the time you get to this period, all puns intended, they're pretty well melded with each other. And by the time you get to the Renaissance and forward, they're the same thing, Father Time. So Kronos is a first generation Greek Titan. He overthrows his father heaven, and he rules during the Golden Age, as described by Hesiod. You get in Ovid Saturn ruling the Golden Age, and when we shift from Greek to Latin. Also, remember, although this is an Egyptian text, or because it's an Egyptian text, the center of Greek language learning and culture in the beginning of the Common Era is not in Greece. The last pharaohs, the Ptolemies, were Greek, and the center of Greek language and culture is in Egypt, particularly Alexandria, and if we're talking about alchemy, further south down the Nile in Panopolis. Anyway, Kronos is ruling during the Golden Age. He has a difficult son named Zeus. Zeus overthrows him, and when Zeus overthrows the Golden Age, you get the Silver Age. And then in the equations that Dee has been making more than a millennia later, he's equating that to being cast out of the Garden of Eden, time beginning, all sorts of things that we've talked about in my class. Okay, so here's the whole quote again. Now, we've got ocean and omega. Why is the letter omega being equated with the brother of Kronos? We know why Kronos is associated, because omega is the 7th and last vowel, and Saturn is the planet that is farthest away. Also, you may remember from discussions we've had of the Timaeus, the planets are what is keeping order in the universe after the world of becoming has passed through this third thing, the receptacle, and you have the world of being. All right. So we're juggling all of that. I told you this gets kind of trippy. Now, if you want to go further, and why not, if you're merging cultural reference the way people are doing in Egypt in the early parts of the Common Era, the oceans are also children of a Babylonian goddess, Tiamat, the glistening or the shining one, who gives birth through a sacred marriage with her husband to a bunch of other divine beings that get rolled into various Greco-Roman beings. Okay, so Tiamat is portrayed as either a creator goddess sometimes, or sometimes as this monstrous embodiment, this serpent of chaos. So merge these together, and she and her husband are the two that fill the cosmic abyss with the primeval waters. You can even, a millennium later, if you want, if you are doing Hermetic Kabbalah, equate them to Chokmah or Binah. You can equate them to parts of the Bible, or you can say, this is just silly, I'm not going to do that. But for now, we're equating everything we can. So they fill the cosmic abyss with the primeval waters. Some people, like one scholar named Yehuda back in 1933, who did a detailed study of all this, looked at the etymology and claimed that Tiamat was a cognate with Northwest Semitic, which would make it a cognate with Biblical Hebrew, and the word tehom for the deeps, the abyss, used in Genesis. So, moving on, because we're still in this first paragraph, remember that just the word omega is O, mega, the great O, the mega O. And it has numerous correspondences, and we've just talked about some of them. Saturn, lead, the Golden Age, the beginning of that which gives the word form and order, including time. Ocean, as the brother, is banished with Kronos to Tartarus after Zeus comes along and causes problems. But on a purely material level, the ocean is salt and water. Add sulfur to salt water, and what you're doing is basically adding divine fire to salt water by all the combinations we've just looked at. So that's kind of interesting for something that is purporting to be about different apparati you use for furnaces. And I'm just going to summarize a bunch of things to get us to Adam and this interesting creation story concerning the four elements. So Zosimus is complaining to his sister. He's complaining about a rival school of alchemists. He doesn't like the way they make tinctures. He says they rely on an old treatise on furnaces and they aren't taking proper precautions. So they congratulate themselves when they should be congratulating their daemons, perhaps when things go right. When things go wrong, they admit they're not taking proper precautions, but they go back and doing things the other way anyhow, probably because they're greedy. And he points out that they are all people dominated by fate, a mistress of the material universe, and they're drawn hither and yon by the train of her dress. He thinks fate-bound metallurgists like these are mindless. They have no conception of anything beyond the material, and he pretty much has no time for them, pun intended. They are certainly not philosophers, he says. Philosophers, Hermes and Zoroaster agree, are superior to fate, and they're not swayed by her gifts or her misfortunes. Then he launches into an allegorical interpretation of another myth by Hesiod, the myth of Prometheus. You probably know this. I won't tell the whole myth. It's fascinating. You can Google it. So Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Pandora. Pandora gets a gift. It causes all kinds of problems. You've got to read that story sometime, but I'm not going to tell it to you now. Then he goes into a discussion of how Hermes stresses that a person has to practice self-understanding. That's important above all because self-understanding is going to lead to an understanding of how the divine mind penetrates matter, penetrates the entire world. And as he continues, the whole notion of how one escapes from fate under the guidance of this Hermetic divine mind or savior mind prompts him to speculate upon the first man. Usually, as you probably know, within an Abrahamic framework, this first man is going to be Adam, and eventually this will be Adam. But not yet. However, if you're in my course on the monad, way back in the letter to Maximilian, we talked about how Adam in Hebrew involves all kinds of language play because there's not vowels. So Aleph, Dalet, Mem can mean a person, a man, red earth, red. Even Adamah can mean ground or earth. And in Kabbalah, you also explore Adam Kadmon, who precedes the development of the four worlds. In the Nag Hammadi text, the perfect anthropos is Adamas, and his helpmate is perfect knowledge, which is a lot different from Eve biting into an apple and getting them kicked out of the Garden of Eden, unless one thinks that the whole getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden is presaging the return, which is then picked up in Christian thought as Yod He Shin Vav He and other things we've discovered. You can see, I'll drop in a link to just the first part of this kind of red earth Adam below. All right, so there's all kinds of play, my point is, with Adam in Hebrew, in studying the Torah, in studying the Bible, and in studying Kabbalah, whether we're talking Hermetic Kabbalah, Christian Kabbalah, or Rabbinic Kabbalah. All right, so Zosimus has been talking about Prometheus. There are some implicit things that I should just remind you of here. Prometheus is the god of fire. He's the champion of humanity, and he's revered by metallurgists. In some stories, he even creates humans from clay, which you could combine easily back to Red Earth Adam, right? Zeus punishes Prometheus for eternity. Now, you can recall why Kronos and Ocean might not like Zeus, right? Zeus has sent them off to Tartarus. So Zeus, although Zeus is the father and ruler of the Silver Age, is, let's say, he has problems. Okay, so Prometheus, who is the primal man, has fallen. and he becomes Epimetheus. And so Zosimus is recounting that, or with allusions, assuming that you know it. And Prometheus becomes the slave of earthly desires. So implicit here is the idea that to the Greeks, some of the Greeks in this time period, most of them, the first human is Epimetheus, and that name means afterthought as opposed to Prometheus, whose name means forethought. To Greco-Egyptians, the first man is Thoth. Now, who has been rolled into Thoth by then? Hermes. So now Zosimus is going to launch into another lost work of Hermes. Zosimus refers to lots of works of Hermes that we don't have. We call them pseudotexts, meaning we don't have any evidence that Hermes actually wrote them. And if he's the first human, wouldn't that be a lot like having text around by Adam? But anyways, that's what's happening here. So this work by Hermes is called On the Inner Life. In On the Inner Life, Hermes condemns magic. We get a whole later thing with Hermes about, what by the Renaissance the distinction between white magic and black magic is. You can almost but not quite make in this period as between what is called magic and what is called alchemy. The alchemy, frankly, seems a lot like magic. Not the metallurgical recipes which work, but the transformations that occur. Okay, Hermes condemns magic and says man must know himself, and when he has come to know God, he must hold on to the ineffable triad. He doesn't say what the triad is. It can easily be the Christian triad, but it can be many other triads as well. Remember, D does the same thing with the ternary. Then Zosimus says one will see the Son of God. He doesn't call the Son of God Jesus here, although Jesus will appear at the end of this. So fate will just work upon her clay, the body, but you become one with God by yearning for him and by so merging with the ineffable light. That sounds awfully similar to the light we've been talking about in my class in terms of Hermetic Kabbalah, in terms of LVX, in terms of the fiat lux of Genesis. Zosimus mentions thrice great Plato, not Hermes, and Hermes he calls infinitely great Hermes. And then we're back to the creation of language. Yes, that's a picture of Thoth you're seeing on your screen there. So Zosimus continues, and he tells us, in the original hieratic language, the hieratic language he's talking about there, the first part of that means sacred. He's talking about hieroglyphs. He's not talking about the hieratic script you may have read about. So his hieratic language here is hieroglyphs. In the original hieratic language of the first man, the interpreter of all that exists and the giver of names to all corporeal beings is designated Thoth. The Chaldeans, Parthians, and Medes, and the Hebrews called him Adam, which means virgin earth, and blood red earth, and fiery red earth, and fleshly earth. Okay, if we think that Zosimus is just kind of blowing smoke and associating whatever he wants, notice that when he comes to Hebrew etymology, he's pretty accurate, okay? So that's one of many, many reasons that we can assume that the association he makes with the letter omega are not idiosyncratic just to him. So then Zosimus says, these interpretations are to be found in the libraries of the Ptolemies, the Greek family that was the family of the final pharaohs, ending with Cleopatra. They laid it away in sanctuary, above all in the Serapeon. That is their the great temple complex in Alexandria. Serapis is a merger of two gods, Apis and Osiris, and you can find more about that on your own, or you may already know. So they laid it away in sanctuary, above all in the Serapeon, at the time when he appealed to Asinas, the high priest of Jerusalem, to send Hermes, who translated the whole of Hebrew into Greek and Egyptian. Now, how did this work if Hermes was the first man? Well, Hermes seems to appear and disappear in different time periods, frankly, because the translation story we get here would have to be later, because in effect, he's saying that Hermes has translated parts of the Bible. I'll come back to that in a minute. So Zosimus continues and says, so then the first man among them is named Thoth, and among them Adam, a name from the language of angels. So this is Thoth and Adam at the same time, and Adam is from the language of angels. And not only that, but with respect to the body, the name they refer to him by is symbolic, composed of 4 elements from the whole sphere. Remember, the sphere is the perfect form in the Timaeus. Within the sphere, you can inscribe the Platonic solids that are the 4 elements. We've talked about all of that earlier. So what we have in this context, I mean, this is just wild, right? We have Adam is made of the 4 elements, watery, divine fire, earth, and air, basically. And Hermes is the original translator or writer of the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. And this is kept at the great temple in Alexandria, which is destroyed when the great library of Alexandria was destroyed, but it hasn't been destroyed at the time that Zosimus is writing this. Here's the remains of the Serapeum today, by the way. This is a public domain picture by David Meyer. So now he's going to do what one does when you look for meaning in a name, right? He's going to talk about Adam, A-D-A-M. For the letter A, the alpha in Adam, of his name signifies the ascendant east. Okay, that actually is sunrise. And I've put ascendant in there because I think that in his translation, what is happening is that Jackson is looking for a word in English to match a word in that starts with alpha in Greek. So the ascendant east, sunrise, Anatoly, the east. That's how you say east. And air, Eris. So that's the first A in Adam. The letter D, or delta of his name, signifies the descendant west. And Earth, which sinks down because of its weight. Then there's some missing text that is referring to the second A in Adam. We'll come back to that in a sec. And the letter M of his name signifies the meridian south, and the ripening fire in the midst of the bodies, and the fire belonging to the middle, the 4th planetary zone. Check out what the 4th planetary zone is, which would also, by the way, then correspond to the 4th vowel, but that's another whole discussion. Jackson, looking at what that missing A is, because there's a lacuna in the text and it's missing, he hypothesizes that it's probably an easy reference, since there's not much space missing, easy to the Arctic North. And that word for Arctic in Greek would start with an alpha. He also wonders if the juggling around with letters that Zosimus seems to be doing is because there's not a Greek word starting with delta for Earth. It could be, but then there's not a Greek word starting with delta for West either. So he's juggling around things, trying to get Adam to correspond to 4 directions and 4 elements. Now, for those of you studying Dee's later conversations with angels with Edward Kelly, or in making Enochian tablets, you may know the problem with directional attributions in those tablets. So you may want to come back and look at this and look at the tablets, but that's a long discussion. I won't get into it here. Those of you working on Theorem 22, notice that gee, there's a omega in here doing some strange things. It's at the bottom of this graphic, and either going up to be an alpha or the alpha is coming down. But we also have some M's in here, don't we? So, which would correspond to mu in Greek. So maybe it will help in understanding this if we make the cross of the elements 4 elements or 4 directions. In effect, he's already done that and set that up, and we've talked about the cross of the elements as the 4 elements until the center is displaced, and we've talked about that repetitive times. Then it is moved up and becomes a stone the builder rejected. All right, let's go back and see how this continues. Zosimus says, so then the atom of flesh is called Thoth with respect to the visible outer mold, but the man within him, the man of spirit, has a proper name as well as a common one. Now, the proper name no one knows for the present. Only Nikotheos, the one who cannot be found, knows it. But his common name is Phos. And from this is followed that men came to be known as Photes. Well, this isn't the etymology that linguists would agree on, but they would point out to you that photes is where we get photo from, and many other things that have to do with light. And it's also a common Greek wordplay in Homer. Because the term for man is thought to be derived from a contraction for the word for light, although the etymology doesn't exactly hold up. But you can see there on your screen the word for man and the word for light. So it is a beautiful, beautiful wordplay. So his common name is light. So when Phos was in the garden, spirited along on the wind, the instigation of fate, they persuaded him, since he was innocent and unactivated, to clothe himself with their Adam, who comes from fate. Remember, we've had a whole polemic against people ruled by fate, who comes from the four elements. But Phos, for his innocence, did not refuse, and they began to exult to think that he had been made their slave. The they here that persuaded him is the four elements. So can you interpret this? The light has become, that is supposed to be the light of spirit, has become subject to the four elements. That's essentially what is going on here. So there's some familiar implicit themes going on. When the Adamic man, Phos, realizes he's more than the four elements, he will be free. He needs the fifth element, the element of spirit. The story continues with reference to Hesiod, Zeus, Prometheus, Epimetheus, and then we get some advice. Actually, this isn't, this is advice that Phos is giving in the story that Zosimus is telling. Zosimus says, the Son of God, being capable of everything and becoming everything, when he wills, as he wills, appears to each. So the implicit thing here is you add the fifth element of spirit to escape the slavery of the other four elements. So then Jesus appears in the story. Jesus appears to Adam and takes him back to the place where those named Photes dwelt before. Needless to say, this isn't the usual chronology that we get in, say, the in the Christian Bible or the Jewish Torah. For one thing, Jesus doesn't appear in the Torah, obviously. But we could continue here at length because Zosimus goes on. But instead, what I'm going to do is just read you the ending. There's multiple word plays, but we won't worry about them for our purposes right now. Okay, here we go. Jesus Christ drew nigh to Adam and bore him up to the place where those named Photes dwelt before. And he also appeared to very powerless men by becoming a man who suffered and was subjected to blows. And he secretly carried off as his spoil the Photes, who belonged to him, because he suffered nothing, but instead showed death trampled underfoot and thrust aside. In other words, in this story, Jesus doesn't die in the crucifixion. And both now and until the end of the world, he comes again, both secretly and openly, to his own and commune with them by counseling them secretly and through their minds to get rid of their Adam, by cutting off and slaying their Adam, whose guidance is blind and who is jealous of the man of spirit and the light. They kill their own Adam. And this will go on, he continues, until the mimic daemon comes, since he is jealous of them and wants to deceive them as before, claiming that he is Son of God. Ugly though he is both in soul and body, this mimic daemon can be equated to an antichrist. But because they have become wiser by their apprehension of him, who is truly Son of God, they yield up to them their Adam, yield him up to death, and save their shining spirits by introducing them into their own realm, where they were even before the world began. But before the mimic, the jealous one, and now this can also be acquainted with the demiurge, by the way, dares these things, he will first send his own forerunner from Persia, there's a lot of reasons about this, which I won't talk about now, but it has to do with the Manichaeans and Mani, if you've studied that history. But before the mimic, the jealous one, dares these things, he will first send his own forerunner from Persia, telling deceptive, fabulous tales and leading men on about faith. The letters of his name are 9 if the diphthong is preserved, and Zosimus talks about that a bit more before ending, but I will stop there. Okay, so that's the kind of merger you get with Judaism, Christianity, Egypto-Roman, Greco gods, and the Greek language in this incredibly trippy time period that is the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. I hope that will help you in understanding the hieroglyphic monad, but if not, it's also really a lot of fun for its own sake. I do want to, and I'll paste these in below, let you know what my sources here were. Oh, and that picture there was the left-hand part of the triptych from Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. So this list of references I'll paste in below. And that's it for today. I'll be back in a few more days and we'll wrap up Theorem 22. See you then. Bye-bye.